Okay, we're live. Welcome, everyone. My name's Mark Parsons. Thanks for joining our session on vocabularies. I might give it another minute or two for folks to connect. One person I want to make sure is here is Rebecca Koskela. It looks like you are. Hi, Rebecca. Could you just confirm that you're there and say something?
I'm here.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. And welcome everybody else. I will go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, so hopefully you all are seeing my screen now. Laura, you can disappear for a little while. And welcome everyone again. And sorry, steering two screens. Just a reminder, I think you all are familiar at this point how this all works. Best to keep your microphone and video off unless you're speaking. Feel free to use the chat and the Q&A for questions is nice because people can then upvote questions that they like, so we get a sense of which questions are most priority. I should have put this in the chat first. I do have some collaborative notes. Let me find them and then I'm gonna have to get out of this for a second. So I've just put in the chat a shared Google Doc. I would appreciate it if you could enter your name and affiliation if you're participating, and your email if you'd like to follow up, depending on what we decide to do with this session. Nope, I put it in the wrong chat.
Yeah, I was just about to notice you put that in the moderators chat, not in the one.
Yep.
All.
So there, now you should have it. So welcome all. We will just an overview of the agenda. I'll give a brief introduction here. We're gonna have a little brainstorming exercise. I will put that bit.ly link up there again, but if you want to capture it now, feel free. Then we're gonna have a review of some current efforts around vocabularies. The data foundational terminology was the result of one of the very first working groups of RDA. And Raphael Ritz will talk about that. Laura Malloy will talk about terms for FAIR skills. You know, FAIR is everywhere. And she'll also talk about a research data management vocabulary from Kazre and CoData. Simon Hodson was going to present on that, but Simon is still recovering from COVID, but fortunately he is recovering. So we hope he'll be back in the game soon. And then Rowan Brownlee will be talking about some work at Ardc. And then I'll talk about some efforts that's been happening with NASA. We'll re-examine our brainstorming approach and then see what we want to do next, where we want to go with this BoF, if we want to create an effort within RDA or tag onto something else or what have you. Advance, please. So language evolves, and dare I say buzzwords evolve. And similarly, the focus of policy and practice also evolve. And these days, you know, lots of governments, agencies, institutions are all over open science. They're developing these open science clouds. You know, EOSC is perhaps the, you know, poster child, but we now have the global open science cloud. But then there's also research data commons, which are similar, but it's not clear that they mean the same thing. And at the same time, we even have, pretty well-defined terms like those embodied in the FAIR principles or in the OAIS reference model. The OAIS reference model, I think one of the most useful things in it is its glossary, but nonetheless, these are often interpreted differently in different contexts. And so my question is really, can we agree on some key terms? And I'm thinking sort of at a high level, sort of at the policy level and basic practitioner level, not the down in the weeds, really specific technical level. But then agree to disagree on others, just capture multiple definitions. So we, trying to harmonize is not necessarily always what we want to do. So just to give some examples, one high level example, open. Okay, open science. Everybody wants to do open science. I don't think we've got a good handle on what open science is. It's very contextual and a very general concept. I can tell you that within NASA, everybody says they're doing open science, but it's all over the map as to how open they are. And then specific things often have very specific meanings around open. So we talk about open access literature, which has these defined categories of gold and green and diamond, et cetera. Open data is a concept that's been around for some time, but sometimes discriminates between openness and cost. I mean, this notion of cost of reproduction, you see that a lot in early open data policies that, no more than the cost of reproduction. But as we move to the cloud, cost of reproduction, media is not really the primary issue. Instead, we're thinking of cost of access. And so it's a question of bandwidth, cloud credits, et cetera. So it's a different type of openness and what cost means there. What does free and open mean in this sense? And then open software, often called open source software, really, when you say open source, you're implying a license. And the license then specifies really at what level of openness it is. And then there's open hardware and open samples. And of course, a physical artifact can't be shared like a digital artifact, but their specifications and descriptions can. Another high-level example, what I call the rewords. These are bandied about all over the place, and I don't think we have a good handle on what we really mean by reproducible or replicable or repeatable. I've even seen replayable. And reusable is right there in the FAIR principles, so it should be understood, but I don't think it really is, and I think we're still grappling with that. And there's lots of rewords. If we go down a level, sort of mid-level examples, there's terms like data set, and I'm like saying, let's not go there. We could talk forever on what does the term data set mean, but we also hear about collection, catalog, protocol, things like that. And these are, used at the program management type level. And again, I don't think we often have a common understanding of what they mean or that there are even multiple definitions. So now I'd like to do a little bit of a brainstorming exercise. So grab this bit.ly, and it's going to take you to I will show you. I'll put the link in the chat as well.
Here's you can post it in the chat, and people just need to click.
Yep. That's the full-blown thing. So this is what they call a Jamboard. It's like a virtual whiteboard with sticky notes. And so what I'd like you to do is just grab a sticky note, like so, and like so, I say, and then start entering, your term of choice that you think is particularly contested, misunderstood, relevant, whatever. So I'm going to give like 5 minutes, and so go wild. Put stickies on there, circle things. Just it's going to be wide open, and do what you like. So there we go. All right, you're off and running. Great, thank you.
Does it matter what color it is, Mark?
You can do whatever color you like. There's also, you can circle things. Just it's for you to play. And we got layers and layers of words. data. Who put that up? Lots of fairs. You'd think we'd understand FAIR by now. Oh, sustainability, nice one. Still coming. Transparency, nice one. Okay, maybe one more minute. Okay, looks like things are slowing down. So we got a lot here. This is great. And a whole slew of interoperabilities. That's obviously an interesting one. I noticed that we have trust as small trust, you know, like the word trust, and trust as the acronym, as in trusted repository. I assume that's what the capital trust means. Storage versus archiving, good point. Curation is always a nice one. Provenance. A couple of the rewords, not so many of the rewords. Reproducible, repeatable. Data science. Several fairs, which is interesting. So just wanted you to get a sense of where people are thinking. E-infrastructure. Yeah, I'm surprised we didn't get more than those. I don't really know what that means. Control, that's an interesting one. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and have the presentations now. And Rebecca is going to be working in the background, seeing if she can identify some themes here, that sort of thing. Oh, AI, yeah, why didn't we get that one in earlier? So we'll revisit this. And so after we've heard some of these current activities, if that informs anything that we want to do here. So we will return to this, but thank you for your contributions. And with that, I think I will pass the screen to Raphael to tell us about DFT.
So hello and good afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are. Do people see my screen by now? Hello?
Yes,
Wait
we
a
can.
second.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Do you still see it?
Yeah, I can see it here.
Okay, great. Yeah, it seems like I managed to trigger it twice. Sorry for that. So first of all, thanks, Mark, for giving me the opportunity to present results from one of the very first batch of working groups that ever got established in the Research Data Alliance, the Data Foundation and Terminology Group. In its first incarnation as a working group, it was led by Peter Wittenberg, Gary Berg-Cross, and myself. And after the working group fulfilled its mandate, we continued kind in maintenance mode in a Data Foundation and Terminology interest group that Gary Berg-Cross and myself then continued for a couple of years And at the moment, I would say we are on the one hand still in existence, but on the other hand, kind of dormant. There has not been much activity recently for whatever reason. The goal, as stated here, is to describe a basic, abstract, but clear data organization model that systemizes the already large body of definition work on data management terms, especially as involved in RDA's efforts. And what we then ended up with during our first phase of activities was a study of existing data models out there in the wild, so to say. Peter and colleagues conducted a fair number of interviews in order to reveal that information in the first place, summarized it, and then we conducted an analysis on those data models with the ambition to come up with a generic core. And based on that generic core, we then started to name things, and that was resulting in the first, what's here called term snapshot, that we produced at the time, and that were part of the deliverables of the working group. Things went on. Already during that time, we reached out to other RDA working groups, and depending on the subject they were considering, we started to include terms and thereby expanded scope. And all this was supported through a web-based tool, a media wiki on steroids, so to say, a semantic media wiki. So the software that runs Wikipedia plus a few add-ons that add semantic capabilities. And this we operated for quite some time, but a year or two ago, we actually retired that for reasons that I might return to later, or if people ask. The problems we wanted to solve, obviously in line with the mission of the Research Data Alliance, is to make data sharing easier and to enable data organizations to communicate more efficiently in the end, as we had to realize that people in the field, albeit dealing with the same or similar things, used different terms, or sometimes even the same terms, but with different meaning. And so in order to get this into order somehow, we started this effort and collected this. And I guess it needs no explanation here in this group that why we did that and what would have been the price of not doing that. Whether we have succeeded in the meantime remains to be seen. I mean, people still manage to talk past each other, but on the other hand, we've seen quite some adoption. Two examples I will mention in a moment. But just so you get an idea of what we were mostly concerned with, it was really the domain of digital object management of registered digital data. And as is indicated on this slide, we are well aware that this is, of course, only a subset of the domain. There is also digital data that is not registered, but of interest in many ways. And then data management as such, dropping the term digital, is of course also relevant, but even broader, and was not in scope for us. So here a few quick links to the results that we've produced. First, the group page from the Data Foundation and Terminology Working Group. The second link is to the results, which are themselves a collection of several documents, like the aforementioned analysis and the overview of the models, the term snapshot. The page for the interest group, and the link to the releases of the DFT vocabulary. And maybe I should say why I say now releases and not the tool any longer. I already hinted at that. for mostly technical reasons on the one hand and lack of support on the other hand, as the RDA Europe projects came to an end, we reached a point where the software stack at the time wasn't maintainable any longer, and so we decided to take this down and just provide a static snapshot of the outcomes, and that essentially are our releases. You will see an example of that in a moment. So in terms of adoption, I would like to mention at least these two examples, which I consider quite high level, and we are actually quite pleased to have seen this. So a large part of our efforts and results went into the update of the ISO vocabulary for information and documentation. So this is ISO 5127, and the update happened in 2017. And our results were also amongst the first 4 submitted to the European Commission for recognition as ICT technical specification, which happened then in July 2017. So we consider that actually quite a success. Now back to what you can access if you follow one of those links before, the one to the releases. If you select the last one, the version 3.0 that we named Gaborone, so according to the place where the plenary happened around the time when this release was done 2.5 years ago, you see, or I indicate here on the slide, we have by now on the order of 400 terms. And this is a big list listing those terms, their definitions, and possibly even more information. And in the rightmost column, you see the DOI, including the part identifier to make explicit reference to this very term with its definition. There are also a number of terms where we were not able to reach consensus on a single definition. And so here I provide just as an example for one such term, namely a collection, where you see there are 3 definitions provided. You also see a bit more how the information is actually structured that we collected. It is possible, in addition to the definitions themselves, to also provide an explanation, to give examples, to give a reference. Definitions can be limited to scope, and this was more a procedural matter. They can have a status like being new or in discussion or approved or rejected and whatnot. Just a few, in closing, a few remarks on the background for that tool, as I could imagine that depending on the outcome of this BoF, if activity follows, it might be interesting to consider experiences from this. It was, as I said, a semantic media wiki plus semantic forms. Oh, sorry, the word forms got missing. Thereby we customized the pages to have the substructure in order to provide the structure that I've just mentioned. So definition, explanation, examples, references, scope, status. And all these could be created possibly multiple times if needed, and an overall categorization was supported. So an individual entry in the web application then looked, for example, like this, a repository registry. And as I said, the wiki as such is not in operation any longer at the moment. I learned in the meantime that the software had actually been updated, so that argument that led us to taking this down doesn't exist any longer. So it should be possible to return to that if needed. On the other hand, what we also learned in the process, the main reason why we've set this up as a wiki was in order for people to have a low barrier of entry for people to contribute. Unfortunately, not much of that nature has happened. And so As a result, the somewhat simplistic approach to ontology development, which this is in the end, hit us then on the other end. So a more proper ontology development tool such as WebProtégé or the like might have been more appropriate for other people for other reasons, but this was what we set out at the time, and we were using for years and to quite some success after all. So I guess with that, I have probably eaten up more time than I was granted. I'm happy to take questions now or after the presentations or during our next round ahead of us. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Raphael. So I have a couple questions. If people have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Thank you. So first, and these are actually sort of related. I'll combine the questions. So where is ISO 5127 used? I mean, who uses that? How broadly is it used? And in the same sort of sense, do you have a sense of how broadly the terms in your set are used?
To the first question regarding the ISO standard, it is mostly of interest, as far as I can tell, in the librarian community, which I'm not particular part of myself, so I can't really judge that from own experiences. I can only report what I know from our colleague Juha Hakala from the Finnish National Library, who was actually chairing the committee at the time that made this update. And for him, this was a big deal. So I understand that in the librarian community, this is something that people pay attention to. But other than that, I'm sorry, I don't think I can say much to your concrete to your question. And then the other thing. To what extent are those terms used? I mean, those terms are almost natural language terms, and they are used all over the place, of course, but that's not what we mean here. To the extent that people make explicit reference to one, or where this applies, one of several definitions, we do not really know. We've never gone through the effort of, for instance, analyzing the web traffic to our release pages and the individual entries. If the DOIs are used in order to refer to them, it may be possible, I don't know even, to get some information from data side, but I never even tried. Okay. I don't know. I've seen Peter around. Peter, do you know more? Do you have anything to contribute to Mark's question, maybe? I don't know whether we can allow Peter to speak.
Yeah, Peter, if you can unmute if you want to chime in.
Or he left already again, since he knows all that stuff.
Yeah, he doesn't actually seem to be online.
Yeah, I only noticed a comment of his earlier in the session.
Okay.
Anyway.
We have another question here, though, from Alicia. Could you talk more about the workflow of submissions, discussion, approval? And I guess also, is that still active?
First of all, as I said, the application is not active at the moment for lack of activity or due to lack of activity for quite some time. And then those technical problems we were running into, we considered it justifiable to not, or I could not consider it justifiable to put more efforts into maintaining that, seeing it's hardly being used or for some. But while we were active and using this for our group discussions, there wasn't really a strict workflow in the sense of a publishing house, let's say, or a journal submission and the like. After all, this is a wiki that was open to anyone. and people could contribute to their liking and also edit other people's contributions. So it was more a matter of self-organization and self-discipline, and people were quite disciplined. So I don't think we ever had issues that people may know from Wikipedia, where sometimes groups even engage in fights over certain issues. Or only to a limited extent, we had that in the beginning, and that was then actually triggering us to support multiple definitions. So that's how we noticed that there are certain terms or concepts related to those terms that people couldn't necessarily agree upon, and then we decided to support multiple definitions. And then when it came to status and status changes, I mean, new is obvious, that's how you start. Being discussed is you switch to that when you realize this is really picked up and people talk about it. Approval was slightly formal in the sense that when we got together during our regular calls, or we met at plenaries, and we returned to that and considered those terms and concepts, and then asked ourselves the question, could we consider this done, quote unquote, and if so, and is everybody okay with it? And then we said approved.
Okay, thank you. All right, thanks, Raphael. I think we need to move on. So our next speaker will be Laura Malloy. And I will share my screen to share her slides. But if you want to turn on your camera so we can see you as you're speaking, that'd be great. Oops, I keep doing the wrong one.
Thanks for doing this, Mark.
Yeah, no worries. Oops, I haven't actually shared.
Thank you. Can everyone see the slides? If you want to click the bottom right-hand corner, you can expand the slide so you can see the text to an appropriate size.
We can see the slides. That's fine.
Great. Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Laura Malloy. I'm the Senior Research Lead here at CODATA in Paris, and I'm going to give you an extremely brief overview of the Terms for Fair Skills initiative, what that is, what we've been doing, and where we are with it now. The Terms for Fair Skills project is basically building a terminology to describe the skills of making and keeping data fair, and it's a highly collaborative project, and I'm aware that I'm speaking on behalf of a lot of different people. And I want to just thank Mark for the invitation, and I also want to thank Pete McQuilton, who seems to be the the key connection between all these projects, who helped out with preparing the overview. You can access the terminology via the link on the screen. I think these slides are available through the shared notes, so if you go through that route, that's probably a lot easier. It is an open repository on GitHub, so you can check that out. You can also access me via the email address on the slide too, laura@codata.org. Happy to pick up any other questions. Anything I can't answer today, I can find out for you, or if you want to be more involved in the work. Next slide, please. So the Terms for Fair Skills initiative has a scope to build a terminology for the competences, skills, and knowledge necessary to make data fair and keep it fair. We are a large group of people. Can you go briefly to the next slide, please, just to show the partners? So there's quite a few people in this group from lots of different organizations, and we're very grateful for their time and expertise. Could you go back to the last slide, please? And between us, we've been working together thinking about this since January 2019. Between us, we've thought of 4 main uses for such a terminology. First of all, to help with the discovery of training resources. So to help people to discover, find, retrieve, evaluate, think about, compare fair enabling training materials. Secondly, to help with design. So anybody who's trying to design, create, assess, or compare data stewardship curricula. And that's not necessarily data stewardship curriculum, meaning official curricula in the university context. It could be also on-the-job training for anybody who has data stewardship as one of their activities or their responsibilities. Related to that is training, so to help trainers who teach fair data skills to identify the skills they want to cover in a given intervention and to find the appropriate materials for that intervention. And also for researchers and others who wish to identify skills gaps for themselves or for the team. So if you're thinking about, oh, what are the skills around making data fair, keeping it fair, it helps you to think about it if you've got a set terminology of formalized competences. And that also plays into the formalization aspect provided by terminology when you're trying to define skills and competences for a job description, or if you're on the other side, if you're trying to write your CV or you're trying to write an application, this gives you a common language. And I think the idea of common language is really useful. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that there has been a lot of expertise shared with us throughout this community, and if you want to join in, obviously you're very welcome. And we're very pleased to have been able to get the benefit of so many people's scrutiny and focus on this work. Next slide, please. And talking of expertise, there is obviously quite a lot of terminology work happening, as Raphael also noted. These three resources here have been particularly scrutinized by the team. You'll notice the second one is CASRI, which I'll be talking about a little bit later on. And the third one is FAIR specific, but you can check out all of these resources if you're not familiar with them through the links on the slide. Next slide, please. So a recent useful development is that the EOSC, the European Open Science Cloud, has a co-creation fund which we applied to, and we were successful in getting funding. Thank you, EOSC, we really appreciate it. And we were funded as a small core team. So instead of the large nebulously defined group of people who were working from volunteer effort, we narrowed down to 3 people focusing on the work with the input and support of this larger group. And the core team is Pete McQuilton from Fair Sharing, myself, and Yann Lefront from eScience Data Factory. Pete and Yann are ontologists, I'm not. So we have a nice balance of skills. And we were working together from last September to this February. And the idea was to continue the development of this fair skills terminology with our annotation and coordination groups to create a version 0.1 or proof of concept version of the terminology. And that was what we set out to do in that 6 months sort of busy period, kind of high speed period of focus. And one thing that I was keen to make sure that I brought up here is, and this is a really nice phraseology here, we wanted to ensure that the terminology had a broad and pragmatic initial spread of terms. So what that means is we were really keen to not just work with one group of training materials to test it, even if that set of training materials was amazing, because we didn't want to tailor the terminology too tightly to one context, one domain, one research discipline. We really wanted it to be open, broad, pragmatic. And so the way we worked was a series of hacks with this large community, and we refined the terms through iterative annotation of people's own training materials by them applying the terminology to their own stuff and then letting us know whether it worked for them or whether it didn't. Next slide, please. So the 2 major training material sets we worked with, first of all, was the Elixir training materials via their TESS platform, and also the CODATA RDA Schools of Research Data Science, particularly the materials that were produced during the FAIR's Fair project period. And so both of those teams were really enthusiastic and really helpful. They turned up to the hacks, they brought their materials, they brought their colleagues, and they worked with the terminology and they applied the terminology to their own materials and talked about the skills and competences that their materials addressed. And then we put everything into Web Prodigy. After each hack, we took the ontologists took the feedback, worked in Web Prodigy behind the scenes. Next slide, please, just for a second. The next slide, please. That's what it looks like in Web Prodigy. I don't know how visible that is. If you enlarge your screen, you can probably see enough detail. And if you can go back to the previous slide. So the ontologists took that set of feedback from each hack, applied it in the Web Prodigy collaborative editing environment. And then when we were happy with a stable version, we put it out onto GitHub for community scrutiny. And we used the Semaphore Annotation tool, which has been derived from B2 Note. And what was nice about the hack sessions was that they all also fed into the improvement of that tool as we went forward. Can you go 2 slides forward? Thank you. This is what Semaphore looks like. So it's a Chrome browser plugin to annotate web content. It's derived from V2 Note. What's nice about Semaphore is that users can add semantic tags, free text keywords, and comments. And you can also export your annotations in JSON LD and CSV format. If anyone's specifically interested in the tool, please just drop me an email and I'll connect you with Jan Lefranc, who's heading development. Next slide, please. So where are we with it today? Well, we have this terminology which has been built iteratively. I'm reassured by the ontologist that it is open, traceable, fair, and follows all best practices in ontology building, which is good to know. We have 612 terms, 262 of which are imported from the Kajai RDM terminology. You can see through the shared notes where the slides are, you can see these further pieces of information. We have a project page on GitHub, termsofairscales.github.io. You can get to the repository through that page, or you can go directly there through this GitHub link. And the EOSC technical report is up there as well, and you can see that in Zenodo. And another nice benefit, as I say, of this work was that we fed into improving the Semaphore annotation tool. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do next, well, we're going to continue development, all of which will continue to be open on GitHub. So here's the GitHub link again. And also Codata is going to be supporting a working group going forward to continue with progress, discussions, review cycles, and other interesting elements of this work. We have a number of potential use cases who may be interested in working further with us on the terminology. If you would like to find out more, or if you have any further questions after today, please drop me an email at laura@codata.org and I'll connect you with the right people. Thanks very much.
Why don't we hold off on questions until after your second presentation, because I think it's closely related and it's quite short. So let me bring that up.
Thank you.
Okay, onward.
Okay, onward. Okay, same applies. If you haven't already enlarged these slides, then go ahead. Bottom right-hand corner is your friend. So I'm still Laura Malloy. I'm still at Codata. I'm going to tell you incredibly briefly this time about the Kajai RDM terminology, even more briefly than the last presentation. Next slide, please. So this is what the Kajai RDM terminology currently looks like. If you have excellent resolution on your screen, you'll be able to see the URL, but don't worry, I'll give you the URL in the next slide. It is intended as a practical reference for individuals and groups concerned with the improvement of RDM, which I think is an excellent reason to do anything. And I guess my small bone to pick with the current situation with this resource is that it's called a glossary. And to my mind, a glossary is something that's specific to one context. And to my mind, thanks, Jez, for putting that in the chat. To my mind, a glossary is context specific. It's for a particular project, website, or book, or something like this. Whereas to me, this is a terminology. And it even says so in the text here. You can see on the page, it says it's to gather key terms for collaborators to share a common understanding. And that phrase, common understanding, to me says it's a terminology. It's for use across contexts and by different people to share and create a common understanding across these contexts. Next slide, please. So basically, I'll be referring to it as a terminology, and that's why. So you can see the link again here, but it's also in the chat, thanks to Jez. So my understanding is that the resource was developed initially by Research Data Canada and then maintained by Kajai. And Codata partnered in 2 review cycles in 2016 and 2017 to help refine and extend the terminology. And then in the middle of last year, we were contacted and asked if we would take on responsibility for curation of the resource. And of course, this is something that we're keen to do. I don't have access to user stats, but I do know that if there is any interruption to the service of this terminology, then we get lots of inquiries. So I know that this is something that is widely used. And also it's a substantial piece of work. There's over 460 terms in this thing. So a lot of work has been put into this. We want to honor that. But we also want to support the community that really wants to use it. And we want to make this a stable, usable resource for as many communities as possible. Our intention to that end is to improve practice on maintaining and governing this valuable resource and how it's presented technically. So for example, I would like the whole thing to be tidied up because it's a little bit ragged at the moment through one thing and another. And also I'd like each term to have a persistent identifier so that it's stable and it's citable and it's more usable. And I also want to surface it in a vocabulary server so that there is a point of truth and it could be more easily reused in different contexts. But our main overarching aim here is to maintain a stable and sustainably governed standard terminology of community accepted terms and keep it relevant by updating it regularly through structured review process. So to that end, we'll be opening a working group to review and refresh the terminology annually. If you're interested in this first round, because I'd like to do my best to recruit afresh every year to make sure that we get lots of diversity coming through the group and make sure that we have lots of different voices feeding in. Please, again, contact me, laura@codata.org, and I'll give you some more information and you can see if it's something that you would like to commit to for the first year. And in short, yeah, that's it. It's a valued community resource. I'm keen to keep this resource alive. If you would like to help, then please get in touch. Thanks very much.
The thumbs are flying.
That's good.
Any questions for Laura on either presentation, of course? Well, I have one. As I believe in the early days, and this is maybe to both you and Raphael, in the early days of the DFT, there was an attempt to bring the CASRAI terminology and DFT together, but I think that they were sort of maybe working at a different level, where DFT was really focusing on digital objects in very precise terms, and the glossary stroke terminology was more at a higher, more human level rather than trying to be implemented at a machine level. Could either one of you comment on how the two resources relate?
I haven't looked in detail at DFT, so I can't, but I do agree with your characterization of the CASRAI one as being possibly more accessible, if you'll forgive me, Raphael, resource for the generalist.
Yeah. No, I think this is a fair characterization, and we have been in touch, well, of course, the people behind this know each other and talk to each other, not the least in the context of RDA, of course. We had a number of joint sessions, and but yeah, there was the aim for at some time, as you say, Mark, to somehow also formally join these efforts and come up with a joint release of a vocabulary or so, but that never materialized for exactly those reasons that were already alluded to. And I would call it peaceful coexistence at the moment.
Okay, thanks.
I think Simon might want to say something. He's put a comment in. Simon's got a better grasp of the history of the CASRAI project before I was on board here.
I suddenly can't. Oh, there's it.
I think I've said everything I need to comment. But I mean, I think Mark's summary and what Raphael said is accurate. But I do know, and if you look through the terms in the CASRAI RDM glossary, or terminology, I should say, you will see that the CASRAI group that was maintaining it did incorporate a number of terms from the data fabric terminology as well.
Okay, thanks, Simon. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Raphael.
Mark, I was slower on muting. There's just one important point that I'd like to make, which I don't think was covered. The CASRAI project and the CASRAI initiative was a fantastic idea. It was something that was funded through membership, but never really managed to create its sustainability, and it went under. The three main products that CASRAI maintained were the RDM terminology glossary, an open access terminology, and a credit terminology. Each of those things has been taken over by respective organizations. Core will now look after the open access terminology, and NISA will look after the credit terminology. So the key outputs that CASRI maintained have been saved for the community, but I think it is worth our reflecting on the fragility of important outputs like this. As Laura mentioned, when the CASRI site briefly went down over the summer, we were inundated with queries as to what was going on, etc. And it is true that through other priorities, Codedata didn't necessarily at that time do a very good job of publicizing that we were going to maintain it and that we had been asked to maintain it by David Baker and CASRI. Nevertheless, I think there's a lesson to be learned about community concern and responsibility for the maintenance of these resources. And it's something that we need to reflect on and that I hope will be considered also in this BoF.
Yeah,
I would very
absolutely.
much like to support that, Simon. Before you were joining, I also included a note on that in my presentation. While we have always been able to maintain the releases of our vocabulary, the application through which we manage the process, we also had decided to take down at some point for lack of resources. I mean, we've been able to operate this for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years, largely through the support of the RDA Europe project series, but at some point that came to an end. And then while I still do take responsibility for keeping the results alive, this is about what we manage at the moment. So it's a very important issue you are addressing here, Simon.
Yes.
The common problem of infrastructure being funded through project funding, which has been a problem for my entire career in data. And I'm amazed that we're not somehow a little bit better at tackling this, but there's no magic bullet. So I do think that it does come down to personal conviction by certain individuals. And obviously that shouldn't be the case. So this is why we're doing a specific job. And I hope I was clear in both presentations that this is a community effort in both cases. And we really, really want as many people as possible, not just to get that spread of perspective and that spread of expertise, but also to get that spread of effort. We really want to make sure that this is something that if lots of people are holding a part of it, it's less likely to drop. And so we want that in both cases, in the CASRI one and in terms of FAIR.
Yeah, very good point, Simon. Definitely something that RDA is grappling with as well, of course. But I think we need to move on. I want to hear from Rowan. But we may revisit this issue at the end. So Rowan, you want to take over and share your screen?
Thanks, Mark. Okay. As an organization, ARDC, oh gee, I'm getting lots of echo here, but I'll persevere. As an organization, ARDC doesn't define or interconnect high-level research data management terminologies. And so it may appear puzzling for ARDC to be presenting at this session. ARDC does, however, undertake related activities that are aimed at guiding people to make informed choices when selecting a vocabulary. And so there's some relationship with the aims of this RDA session, particularly in the area of supporting bringing together members of research communities in consideration of relationships across vocabularies. And in so doing, developing information aimed at helping users make informed selections among semantically overlapping vocabularies. In this presentation, I'll briefly describe an example of an ARDC approach to addressing that question of the development of guidance to assist vocabulary selection. But first, some brief background on ARDC. Funded as part of the Australian Federal Government's National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy, ARDC partners to fund and create nationally significant assets, facilities and services in support of research. ARDC provides services, one of which is a vocabulary service called Research Vocabularies Australia. Includes support for editing and management, publication and discovery of vocabularies, and machine interfaces for integration of vocabularies into other systems. In 2019, ARDC undertook a service review based upon community consultation and discovered that as more vocabularies are contributed to the vocabulary service, users have reported uncertainty in making selections when faced with semantically similar or overlapping vocabularies. They express concern about making the wrong choice and want guidance to make informed choices. In this example, taken from a search on the ARDC Vocabulary Publishing Portal, an extract results for a concept search on borehole. 4 vocabularies, each containing a concept for borehole. How is the user to know which vocabulary to use for their particular purpose? And why has this happened? Well, ARDC has made the vocabulary service available to its partners, and ARDC has not taken an editorial stance. Rather, the ARDC approach has been that if there are competing classifications or worldviews, then having them available will allow for mappings or correspondences across them. Within a context of semantically overlapping vocabularies, this is some information about a direction that ARDC is taking. ARDC aims to work with research domain representatives, particularly those with an interest or experience with informatics, to work with those groups to develop guidance that will help users select the vocabulary for their particular purpose. ARDC wants to make it easier for users to find vocabularies, to understand which vocabulary to use in which context, and to ensure that selected vocabularies are fit for purpose and backed by the community. And in approaching this issue, ARDC would in some way contribute to improving standards management more broadly. And here's an initial example of this approach involving the Australian Earth and Environmental Sciences community. The discussion is happening through a subcommittee of an existing Earth and Environmental Science Forum. The subcommittee comprises facility representatives who have an informatics background. As a first step, the group undertook a survey of vocabularies used at Earth and Environmental Science national facilities in Australia. For each facility, just a couple of simple questions. What are the vocabularies that they use, and for what purposes are those vocabularies used? The survey had a good response, and the group is now discussing options to develop the information into guidance material. And so, returning to the earlier example, as a very first step, using information from the survey, ARDC will provide additional metadata capturing examples of use. So this organisation uses this vocabulary for this purpose. There will also be links to descriptions of the organisations that use the vocabularies, information provided by each organisation describing its role and its relationship to informatics initiatives. And provision of this information should complement other initiatives, for example, the 10 simple rules for making a vocabulary fair, and work undertaken by those such as Leslie Wyborn to consider development of a 5-star classification of vocabulary quality, sustainability, usability. And so in summary, ARDC provides a vocabulary publishing service. Service users are publishing vocabularies that are semantically overlapping. The existence of multiple overlapping vocabularies is causing concern among service users, and service users report uncertainty about which vocabularies to use for what purpose. One approach that ARDC is trying is to identify which vocabularies are used by members of a research community, particularly those members with some experience and standing within their community in the area of informatics, and then to identify the purposes for which those vocabularies are used. What are the preferred or recommended or authoritative vocabularies in a particular research domain? And what are some concrete illustrative examples of how those vocabularies have been used? And in gathering this information to help others answer questions like, I have a purpose that would suit a vocabulary. I don't know which to select. Can I see some examples of vocabulary use that match my purpose? And that's the end of my presentation. Thanks, Mark. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Rowan. Questions for Rowan? Not seeing any. I note that there's a question left over from before for Laura, Simon, Raphael. You all might want to take a look at that in the Q&A, and we can get back to that in a little bit. It's just how your work relates to other classic work. I'm going to quickly introduce some stuff from NASA, which is a little bit orthogonal to what we've been talking about so far, but I think it might be illustrative, and then we'll go into a more group discussion. Oh, hold on a second. So are you seeing my slide now? Oh, there go the thumbs. All right, yay. Okay, so this isn't really a vocabulary exercise, but NASA has a new initiative to try and build a catalog, quote unquote, across the 5 science divisions of NASA. So the 5 science divisions are Earth science, heliophysics, astrophysics, planetary science, and biological and physical sciences. So basically Earth, Sun, planet, space, and then the experimental sciences that are done on the space station and things like that. And the idea is this catalog should help researchers find data, software, documentation, etc., across all these different divisions, which to date have acted actually quite independently. And somewhat in association with this is to establish a SMD standards group or process to assist in identifying relevant standards and facilitating the review of those standards. And part of this comes from the recognition that there's a symbiotic relationship between discovery and standards. And this comes from work in the data discovery paradigms group within RDA, that standards make effective data discovery and access possible by ensuring consistent search through the adoption of community-adopted vocabularies, consistency across repositories by ensuring the same labels and vocabularies are used throughout a community-adopted metadata standard. Easy to read and understand metadata, agreed on practices, and allowing interoperability for both human and machines through agreed upon APIs. So there needs to be harmonization if we're going to do this discovery across the different divisions, which literally covers the universe. And so it's important to clarify that the catalog is not going to replace existing division catalogs, but it's going to be better than data.gov. So it'll get you where you want to go, but it's never going to be completely replace, the things for the experts. We haven't made any architectural decisions yet. Catalog indicates an idea, not an implementation per se. We just want to make sure that we get this cross-divisional discovery. And the working group will be formed and will develop its own guidelines. That's sort of an aside. So I'm not going to go into great detail there, and I don't expect you to be able to see this. This is just a bunch of mind maps. This is in a tool called Coggle. As we've been going through the exercise of trying to understand all the various search interfaces and information models within NASA, we've been building concept maps of all these things. And then as furthering from those concept maps, we've started to write definitions, because the same terms mean different things in different divisions, even in different archives within the same division. And so just as one example, looking at services. So if we're thinking about developing standards, what are the sort of services that are provided will define a lot of what the standards are needed to enable these services, especially as they start working across these divisions. again, I'm not going to go through this, but just to highlight that we're taking this sort of concept mapping approach to trying to understand the landscape rather than going through and actually doing, a comprehensive list of definitions. But as we go through this, just to give you a sense, there's various types of services that are provided. As we go through this, we recognize that sometimes we need to agree. Some things we're going to have some agreement across SMD, the Science Mission Directorate. And these three particular things in the service space seem to be really critical: service, interface, and protocol. These, of course, all have definitions. There's probably definitions in the CASRA thing. I'm sure there's definitions in DFT, but we, again, came up with our definitions that works for us that can hopefully work across SMD. I'm not going to go into the definitions, but just say to highlight that there's sometimes you need to agree. Sometimes we can differ. And so these two terms, survey and catalog, really interesting. In survey, in the social sciences, this is a social sciences archive, it's a collection of information from interviews and questionnaires of people. In the classic sense of surveying the land and its topography, there's USGS centers that work closely with NASA. In astronomy, it's a measurement of an astronomical phenomenon, usually in sort of strips of range of angles, maybe looking at a transit of a moon across a planet or in a particular bandwidth. So and then similarly, catalog also has very related but different terms. And rather than trying to, harmonize them, it's similar to what Raphael was saying. We just have to recognize that these terms are different. Catalog almost means data set in astronomy. And it goes back to, pre-digital ages when they would have a catalog of stars, for example, that were of observations. So that's it. That's all I wanted to say is we're not really working on we've talked about the need of a glossary. We're going to need to have some term, and it is a glossary in the sense that Laura meant, in that it's something that will work within NASA to make sure that NASA can talk a common language, or at least know when we're disagreeing in terms of developing standards and so forth. But part of the reason that I wanted to start this BoF is to learn more about what's going on in the rest of the world. So while we need to solve the NASA needs, we want to be able to make sure that we plug into the broader community. So that's just a real high-level view of where we're going. Happy to take any questions. As I figure out where things are. Well, there is a question for Rowan. So Rowan, maybe you can chime in. Can you comment on how you have dealt with vocabularies that semantically overlap?
Mark? Well, essentially the vocabularies exist there in the publishing service, and we don't ourselves express relationships between those vocabularies or between the concepts within them, as we don't have the domain expertise to do that. And so that's why we're really seeking to work with domain communities so we can discuss with informatics colleagues, here are a group of semantically overlapping vocabularies. What does this mean? Is this an issue? Is there information that can be developed that would help users faced with competing choices to make an informed choice about selecting a vocabulary? And if, for example, the community wished to come together to harmonize vocabularies or to assert mappings between concepts, then ARDC would similarly seek to support that activity. For example, if a community wished to develop correspondences between vocabularies, we'd look at a means to publish and describe and make accessible those mappings.
Okay, great. And then the, sort of a related follow-up, does the ARDC vocabulary support open link data /RDF?
Yes, the basis for the vocabularies that are published is SCOS, SCOS RDF, and we can include other properties from other RDF vocabularies as well.
Okay. And the same questioner, Philip, notes that the Norwegian RDA group is going to work on translating or aligning RDM terminology in Norwegian, and be interested in learning more about any internationalization efforts going on or in association with the RDA Data Foundation and Terminology IG.
Yeah, I can briefly comment on that. A couple of years ago, there was actually some interest expressed to provide translations of the DFT vocabulary, first and foremost to Chinese, actually. And I remember we discussed this at the very least during 2 plenaries, and there was also a Chinese colleague seemed seriously interested in tackling that. But how should I say? I never learned whether that got anywhere. Let's put it that way. For other languages, I remember we briefly discussed providing, for instance, German or French translations of the English terms and their definitions. But in the end, I think there was not really enough, well, not necessarily interest, but probably need to justify the effort that this would have taken. And so people put their resources elsewhere.
Okay, I want to move on. We only have about 20 minutes left, and I want to make sure we have some discussion and looking at what's next. So while you all were listening to the presentations, Rebecca Koskela was busy working away in the background, looking through our Jamboard, our stickies, which I hope you now see on the screen. Oh shoot! But now I lost 2 people. Rebecca, you want to just maybe? Oh, here no, you're not seeing it yet. Now you should see it. Rebecca, you want to chime in and sort of say what your observations were and what you did here?
Sure. So a lot of this is very much in context, just like you said for NASA. So in particular, control depends on the context. You're either controlling an experiment or were you talking about control of data? But here's my first pass at it. So down here, down in the bottom right corner are the data words. I just put them all together. To the left of that are software and licensing, because those seem to be related. Then just up from that, software as an interface, so interface went there. And over in the bottom left corner, I put storage, archiving, repositories, preservation, and just outside of that, I put sustainability, because that's usually what you're trying to sustain. And often curation are the people actually are at the repository. So that's close to there. Registry and Catalog, similar but different. Up in the top corner are more infrastructures. And I still don't know exactly what is meant by e-research. It gets used a lot, but I don't know if it's in the same way. AI and machine learning I put together. I put the RE words together because they can relate to almost everything. And then the upper right corner are the acronyms: trust, fair, and then small trust with a small t, I put by transparency, but I still kept it over here. And then the rest of the acronyms that have to do with data. But just a first pass, and I'm sure people would put these in a different order.
Any thoughts, comments on this? I want to, I have some questions I'm going to specifically ask you all in a little bit, but just any sort of reactions. And did the presentations maybe change any of what you put up there in the first place?
Yes, I added catalog because it wasn't up there. I put it by registry. Yes, it actually did. I was trying to figure out what to do with control until you talked about the context of things. And I added, based on one of the presentations, that's when I moved transparency over by small trust.
Anybody else have any reactions, thoughts? Anybody think that they want to put up another sticky? Don't all jump at once.
So I think I'm certainly thinking about it a bit longer. I think it's, if nothing else, it's a good reminder that some terms that we use with the easy assurance that everybody understands them and shares them are actually not that clear to others. So yeah, I guess that's a preliminary thought.
Anybody else?
Hi, if I can make an
Please.
observation. I think it's interesting to think about the kind of words that we would expect researchers to understand and that we as kind of support providers would expect to understand and use. I think, like, I put data up as a fundamental word because from my previous role supporting RDM in a university library, like, people would often ask, like, but what is data? What counts as data? What do I have to share? I think there are different levels of terminology that we could potentially expect different people to understand and use. Like, I wouldn't necessarily use fair when I'm talking to researchers, but I would talk about the principles in other terms. So I think it might be interesting to look at the terms in that context.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I think it makes a big difference talking to researchers versus talking to other insiders. I'm noting in the comments that Alicia says that services is a big one. Yeah, indeed. This is something we've been struggling with in NASA. And Simon is saying, Laura, this point is important. Of one of the key purposes is disambiguation between the different contexts. So yeah, context is everything. DFT has 6 definitions for data, only 6. Simon, I don't understand. You can respond verbally to Alicia's question. Is that a different? That must be something earlier.
Well, you mentioned it earlier that there was a question in the Q&A addressed, I think to Raphael, Laura, and myself.
Right.
From Alicia as to whether these had taken into account, what was the term she used? Classic terminological or lexicographic initiatives in this domain. And on one level, in the RDM domain, I'd be intrigued to know what Alicia means by classic initiatives. Something that I would say is that when CoData sort of partnered, as Laura mentioned, in 2 of the review cycles for the CASRAI RDM glossary, we did so with and agreed with CASRAI and with the community with a 3-fold objective. One was to broaden the geographical scope of input, which we felt was important. It was very North Atlantic, and CoData, through its membership, has a lot of engagement in other parts of the world, and we made an effort to bring more geographical diversity into the working group. That's one point. A second point was that we did feel at that time that the glossary had not engaged as much as it might with some, and this is what Alicia may be referring to, some key reference models. So obviously the OAIS model we felt wasn't sufficiently incorporated in some of the definitions, and that's something that we sought to address. And a third aspect, which we probably address less effectively than the first 2, would be particular domain definitions. Now, that's a tricky area for the RDM terminology. It intends to be domain agnostic, to talk about RDM as its own thing, but nevertheless, in various research domains, particularly, for example, in the DDI suite of products, there are discussions of the life cycle of data which need to be accommodated. And CoData, because of our membership because of the membership in CoData of international scientific unions, which themselves do lots of terminological work, we felt that was something that we should try to address where it was relevant. It's important that the CASRAI RDM terminology shouldn't go down rabbit holes of particular domain definitions, but there is a sort of the overlap, if you like, in the Venn diagram between what's relevant for generic research data management and how particular domains view those terms. And that was something that we wanted to unpick. And I'm not sure that we made any progress in that, but it was an objective.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Simon. And Lauren's also pointing out that need to be mindful of the differences between STEM and humanities and social sciences. At a very, at a high level of separating domains. I think that's really key. Alicia, you sounds like you have maybe want to have a comment.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for that answer. It explains a lot. I think where my head went was that the approach that you've outlined in this group is more eliciting suggestions from the group, more of a survey type approach. But there are, I was thinking of the typical corpus driven approaches where you just look at how policies and technical standards and so on are using this terminology from different regions, right, in different scopes, and starting like having that as a parallel set of data to construct these definitions from, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. Yeah, there's multiple ways to approach trying to come to formal vocabularies. Hey, so we only have a few minutes left, and I do want to get some feedback. In the notes, it's great. Someone's already seen it. I put a link to the notes, and there's 3 questions at the bottom of the notes. Was this a useful exercise? Should there be more work in RDA to harmonize and cross-map vocabularies? Do we need something new, or are there already adequate efforts that maybe just should be reinvigorated? Laura mentioned that they're going to establish a group to keep the CASRAI terminology alive. Maybe that could work more closely with DFT this time. So please just take a few minutes to answer those questions as you see fit. And then while you're doing that, I will vamp a bit. We have a repeat of this session. I think it's breakout 9. It's later today, so it would be, I think it's midnight UTC or thereabouts. It's 5 o'clock my time, 5 o'clock Mountain Time, if that helps. And I will endeavor to keep us more on time that time, and hopefully we'll have a bit more time for discussion at the end. My personal takeaway is that there is still a key need for this. I mean, there's always a need for vocabularies. I think this contextual issue is going to be really critical, how to address that. And that's why I was hoping, and I'm not sure this is possible, to keep things at that upper level. This idea for this BoF actually originally emerged from a CoData US meeting. I'm part of the US National Committee for CoData. And particularly in the emergence of the Global Open Science Cloud and Global Open Research Commons. And what does that mean? And so Open Science Cloud is not a term that has taken hold in the US as it has in other parts of the world. But I mean, we're going to have to figure out how at a policy level, we're harmonizing. So that's one context that I think is particularly critical, is that sort of policy level. I think also the level of, I think it was Lauren that was talking about that, you know, communicating with researchers and not just playing our own inside baseball. Pardon the American metaphor. So I think I'm just going to let you all type away. We have 5 minutes and 12 seconds. Does anybody else want to, you know, share some impressions? What ideas for what's next? Do we need something new? The only person I've seen, we only have one answer to that. I have my opinions, but I'd like to hear what other people think. If you fail to just enter it in the chat or be bold, unmute yourself and step into the fray. Nobody's bold. Okay, well, at least you're all typing. And then I think after the second session, a couple of us, the speakers and Rebecca perhaps, maybe we will try and synthesize and maybe make some suggestions as to where to go next. And just to tip my hand, I guess, since you all are being quiet, is I'm not sure we want to start something new. We want to do better at harmonizing what already exists.
That would be my suggestion also. I
got a lot of thumbs and hearts are flying too. Yeah.
I've been to a lot of sessions where there's a lot of duplication, and it's obvious when you bounce around to different sessions. So if we could find a place to be a task force or some part of a current active interest group, I think it might be better.
Laura, can you say what the status is of reinvigorating the CASRA? You said you wanted to spin up a new group. Have you proposed something or anything?
I think the idea is that we run that from Codata, and it's
okay.
one of the, but that's absolutely up for discussion.
Well, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, and that's open obviously to anybody who's interested to. It doesn't sign anybody out.
So you're actually going to propose that as a Codata task group?
That's still to be discussed with Simon. Once he's back at work. Oh, he's here. Okay.
Yeah. Can I come in on that? That would be an ongoing Codata activity. So it wouldn't be a Codata has a number of ways of doing things. We have essentially task groups and working groups. Working groups are set up by the executive committee or on the wishes of the executive committee for strategically important things, and this would be one of those. The other way we do things is by task groups as are approved by the General Assembly. That wouldn't be an appropriate way to do this. Essentially, what we want to do is to continue the CASRI way of working. I have always had a lot of respect for the way David Baker managed things at CASRI. I like their approach to doing things. And essentially what they would do, they would establish a working group. They would put out an open call for participation. And that working group would do what they called a review cycle. That means that the working group would meet a few times, would identify a set of terms, either terms where they felt there was a gap and new terms should be developed and added to the glossary, or terms where they felt that there was a need for revision, update, refinement of the definition and the content. And the working group would do its work. They would come up with those revised definitions or those new definitions. They would be published for open feedback. They used a chat board tool for that. And there would be a certain period of time where anyone could comment and add suggestions, and then the term would be closed for another cycle, and the working group would renew and continue its work piecemeal through the terminology in that way. And it just strikes me from a practical point of view, that's an effective way of combining the need for particular focused expertise on the development of the terminology, and the need for broader community review. And that's what we'll be reproducing. And as Laura said, she'll be leading working groups on both of those activities, the Category glossary and the terms of first skills.
Great, thanks, Simon. Okay, we're down to our last seconds. Feel free to keep adding to the document as you all see fit, and we will have this session again in some hours. My initial takeaway is that this CODATA working group, perhaps with good connections to RDA and other initiatives, might be a way to make sure that this sort of continues. But let's see what happens, and we'll get back to you all. Thank you all for your participation. Enjoy the rest of your RDA.